What is basic to life endures through time. 3,000 years, Egyptians left husks and grains within the massive walls of the pyramid to sustain the afterlife of a departed pharaoh. For even then, bread was the staff of life. The Egyptians were among the first to make raised bread using wheat because it rose most successfully. In the hot air, yeast spores fermented the dough, raising the bread almost miraculously from its flat form. To bake the leavened bread evenly, Egyptians devised cylindrical ovens. Wages were paid in bread. Offerings to the great pharaohs were made with bread, more than 40 varieties, adding honey, fruit, almonds, and cinnamon. From the inexhaustible Nile Valley came a full third of the grain used by Rome and all Italy. It was the Romans who first built mechanical mills, set in motion by slaves, later driven by water. Roman millers were also bakers, and baking was a profession. Newly established bakers' guilds determined who would enter the trade. With state control of all bakeries, bread became political power. As Rome's legions spread, the technique of leavening bread was carried along the road of Roman conquest. Everything to do with bread in the Middle Ages was made mystical and magical by the embodiment of Christ in bread. For Jesus had said, "Take, eat, this is my body." Monks carefully prepared the sacred bread, removing the bran to give the loaf a white, finer texture. Priests often sold extra hallowed loaves to rich noblemen. These landowners could afford time and wasted grain to have white bread made for them, while the peasants subsisted on coarse bran bread. Henry II of England made law the distribution of bread by class when he decreed that only priests and noblemen eat fresh white bread. For several hundred years, the peasant was deprived of the ability to make healthy bread. Grains he grew contributed to the ever greater splendor of the nobility, while the peasants starved eating bread made with ferns, straw, and bark from trees. But the Protestant Revolution demanded freedom, religious freedom, with the belief that what is human is also holy. Human dignity was extended to the common man who worked the soil. America, being settled to the west, promised individual freedom, vast lands where a man could cultivate the earth and feed himself. The family bread was the first concern of American settlers. But not until the mid-1800s would the European plea for bread be heard. In 1834, Cyrus McCormick invented the reaper, and in 1836, John Deere made a steel plow. Within 30 years, the Midwest was producing millions of bushels of wheat for Europe. A torrent of wheat was pouring out of America. Grain for bread. The basic way of making bread has changed very little since the first loaf was made. Here I'm using whole grain flour, which is simply the wheat grain ground up. There are no additives and nothing has been taken away from it. Now here I have a cup of milk which I've scalded. I'm going to put it here and let it come to room temperature. It's very important that all the ingredients be at room temperature because when you work with yeast, you're working with a living organism and you don't want to give it a shock. The yeast is the most important ingredient. Its action is going to make the bread rise. And don't be afraid of working with it. You just have to remember that it's a living organism and it has to be kept at a comfortable temperature. So the water I'm going to put it into is about the temperature of a comfortably hot bath. Not too hot or it would kill the yeast. And if it's too cold, the yeast would just lie there and remain dormant. So I'm going to sprinkle 2 tablespoons of yeast on the water. I'm not going to stir. And then I'm going to add a tablespoon of honey, which is going to serve as a nutrient for the yeast and help it to act faster. Now, in about 5 to 10 minutes, the yeast will actually start bubbling up, and you'll see it come to the surface of the water. This is called proofing, and when that happens, it's ready to use. Now, making sure that the milk is at room temperature, I'm going to pour it in the bowl and start the bread. I'm going to add a tablespoon of oil. It could be safflower or corn germ. 2 teaspoons of salt. And 3 tablespoons of honey. Now stir this all together. And now add the yeast mixture, which you can see was all nice and foamy at the top. Alright, now I'm going to start adding the flour. 1 cup at a time. Now, I'm going to add about 1 more cup of flour. And at this point, it's very important to beat the mixture and keep beating it in the same direction, because now we're going to be developing the gluten. Gluten is a stringy substance that can be developed in the wheat flour either by stirring and also by kneading. The reason bread rises is because the yeast forms little bubbles of carbon dioxide, and then these long strings of gluten stretch, and so the bread is like a series of balloons. Now, in order to develop the gluten, I've added about half the flour, and I'm going to stir, I'd say about 300 strokes. Or you could do it in an electric mixer for about 5 minutes. So now you can see this mixture is actually changing, and strings of gluten are starting to form, and it's looking very smooth and not lumpy. So when it reaches this stage, it's okay to add the wheat germ. This is going to add more nutrients to the bread, in this case B vitamins, vitamin E, and iron. I could also add soy flour, which would add more protein, or milk powder, which would do the same thing. But when you are adding something like this, it's going to make the bread heavier. I would say the maximum would be a cup for every 4 cups of flour. So it's very important that the gluten be developed before you add it, so that it can hold it up and the bread can still rise. Now I'm going to continue adding the flour. It's very important at this stage to start watching the dough. One of the biggest mistakes of bread makers is to add too much flour, and then the dough becomes too stiff and very difficult to work with. Now, when it becomes very difficult to add more flour and the dough is kind of in a sticky mass and pulled away from the sides of the bowl, it's ready to be turned out on the board to be kneaded. So, I'll sprinkle the board with some flour. And this is the best part. I'm going to knead the dough. This is the thing that makes bread making. So to knead, I'm going to fold the dough over toward me, push down with the heels of my hands, turn it a quarter turn, fold, and push. Turn, fold, and push. Being sure to keep the board floured and also flour on my hands. And as you knead, the dough will get less sticky and more elastic. This is because I'm developing the gluten by kneading. Now there, it's getting a little sticky, so add a little more flour. But be careful not to add too much flour. As you knead, the dough will definitely become less sticky, so you won't need the flour to keep it from sticking. If you add too much flour, the bread will get very heavy, and it will become very hard to knead. Now, I've been kneading for about 10 minutes. The way to tell the dough is definitely ready to be put to rise is by looking at it. It's smooth, it's elastic, it doesn't stick to the board, it doesn't stick to my hands. It's about the consistency of my earlobe. So, I'm going to take a bowl, put a little oil in the bottom, put the smooth side of the dough down, squish it around, turn it over, so there's a film of oil on the top of the dough. This is so it doesn't form a crust as it's rising. I'm going to put it in a warm place to rise on the back of the stove, in a turned-off oven, someplace where there are no drafts. And when I let it rise, I'm going to cover it with a damp cloth. Of course, wheat is just one of many grains that can go into your bread. People in all parts of the world cultivate and eat different cereal grains. Cereal plants are annuals that depend for their survival on large seeds. The cereal grain contains not only the embryo of a new plant, but also a rich store of food to sustain the plant's early life. Each grain is packed with nutrients, protein, oils, carbohydrates, vitamins, and minerals that can nourish man. In the Western Hemisphere, corn, or maize, has been cultivated for 7,000 years. By the time of the Spanish conquest, the Peruvians were selectively breeding the varieties with the most food value. In Mexico, a flatbread made of corn, a tortilla, is prepared and eaten today as it has been for centuries. Rice is one of the oldest cultivated grains. It was probably being grown in China and India late in Neolithic times. It remains today the most important cereal in Asia. Another ancient grain, millet, fed vast populations in Africa and parts of Asia long before the invention of the plow. It is still the favorite grain of the Mongol nomads. In the Middle East, barley is still ground into flour, mixed into dough, and baked into bread, as it has been since earliest Egyptian times. Both rye and oats originated as weeds in the fields. Because of rye's willingness to grow where wheat would not, it quickly spread all across northern Europe and Russia, while oats became the mainstay of Scottish and Irish diets. The choice of which grain is best for making bread became a question of cultural allegiance. In his famous English dictionary, Samuel Johnson defined oats as food for men in Scotland, horses in England. To which a Scotsman replied, "England is noted for the excellence of her horses, Scotland for the excellence of her men." Whole grain breads are made in every imaginable shape and size, and for centuries of holidays and festivals, elaborate traditional breads have been baked. This has been rising for an hour. It's double in bulk, and when I poke my finger in it, the hole remains. So now I'm going to punch it down to release the gases and get the yeast in touch with new food. Now turn it out onto the board and form it into a loaf, trying to keep the smooth side on top, sort of just turning it like that, patting it into a loaf shape. Put a little oil in the pan. It's important to oil the pan very well because whole grains tend to be more sticky. I'm going to put it into the loaf pan, seam side down. Just kind of put it in there, round out the top, and make sure the sides of the bread are touching the sides of the pan because it's going to need the support when it rises. I'm going to put it in a warm place to rise again, cover it with a damp towel. Delicate yeast cultures used at home to leaven bread could not survive the journey west with American pioneers. Instead, they relied on the 4,000-year-old method of making sourdough bread with a little leftover fermented dough. With their pot of sourdough starter aboard ship, strapped to the back, or stashed in a covered wagon, Columbus, gold-seeking 49ers, and the settlers that followed were ready to make bread anywhere they stopped. Replenished every time bread was made, the treasured sourdough starter lasted until homesteads were established. Until this day, some old-timers claim. Bread is so important that the lack of this most basic food has warned of starvation in times of war, crop failure, and famine. Bread lines formed in every country involved in the First World War. As the lines formed during the Second World War, Herbert Hoover observed, "World peace means a piece of bread." This bread is ready to bake, It's been rising for 30 minutes, and when you push your fingertip in, the print just springs back. Don't let it rise too much, or it might fall in the oven. It should actually do its last bit of rising when it's baking. Now I'm going to glaze it. This is a whole egg with a tablespoon of water beaten in. This is going to make a rich, dark crust. I could also glaze it with egg yolk or egg white, which would make a crisp crust. Or I could glaze it with milk or butter, which would make a soft crust. I'm going to sprinkle it with sesame seeds and put it in a 350-degree oven in the center rack for about 50 minutes. At the turn of the century, home baking began to fade out as mass production of bread took over. Grindstones were replaced by steel roller mills, which removed the bran and ground the remaining grain much faster. These high-speed rollers heated the oil substance in the kernel. This was apt to make the germ rancid, and in turn clogged the grinding surface. So millers began to screen out the germ, thus removing the vitamins, minerals, and essential oils in the grain, leaving a starchy white flour. The miller's trade propagandized pure, refined white flour, which could keep indefinitely on store shelves due to the removal of the grain's living source. Today's mass production turns train car loads of bulk ingredients into inexpensive loaves for supermarket shelves. To produce the soft, squeezable white bread that families demand, the modern baker conditions dough with chemical emulsifiers, improvers, and extenders. Chemical softeners will keep the bread spongy long after it is stale, and mold inhibitors will keep it looking oven fresh. With the addition of these standard chemical ingredients, a modern bakery can rapidly produce millions of loaves that will look the same, taste the same, and stay the same. When nutrition research began to identify vitamins and minerals, it became evident that white bread was deficient in nutrients. So during the Second World War, bakers began to enrich their bread. Iron and vitamins B1, 2, and 3 now enrich most commercial bread. But most of the other nutrients that were originally in the whole grain, vitamins A, B6, D, and E, and minerals like calcium, zinc, potassium, and magnesium, are still depleted and never replaced. Here's the bread out of the oven. It's baked for about 50 minutes. It should, if you wrap it, just fall out of the pan. You might have to loosen the edges with a knife. To test it for doneness, thump it on the bottom and it should sound hollow. I'm going to put it on a rack to cool so it doesn't get all soggy. Well, here's some other whole grain breads, all made with yeast. This is a whole wheat that hasn't been glazed. This is a sourdough whole wheat. This is a rye bread that's been made with molasses and is very dense and heavy. This is a braided egg bread, which is quite rich. Here are a few pretzels and a roll. It's wonderful to make your own bread. You know all the things you put into it, whole grains, nutritious ingredients that haven't been adulterated. It's something you've done with your hands. It fills your house with this incredible aroma. It's really a good thing to do. Well, you should wait a half an hour before you cut it if you want nice even slices. But I think I'll try some now.